Then we have some data that has been collected, and I'm actually going to ask you to look at some of the data and come up with some action plans and what you think could be done to improve some of these ILOs. So anyway, first things first. Okay, we have these 6 ILOs, and we've actually been assessing them. Some of you might have been the lucky few that got to assess some of them in your courses. So we started last year in 18-19, and we assessed communication and critical thinking.
Oh wait, that's not a year.
Well, academic year, sorry. All right. Language. Okay, so we did both written communication and oral communication, and we did critical thinking. And we kind of had, remember the lottery? Everybody, the lottery, nobody wanted to win? Yeah. So we had the lottery, and we tried to make it somewhat simple. We picked 2 or 3 courses from every school and kind of brought all that data together and assessed those learning outcomes. In doing that, we kind of found that we didn't have enough data, right? We didn't really have good data. We had some data, but it wasn't great data. So what happened between last academic year and this year academic year is the deans met, and they picked some more courses that could align to each ILO. So we kind of threw out the lottery and have some good courses that address each ILO. So this fall, we assessed quantitative reasoning and civic engagement, and we have a much, much larger sample. And it's not done. All we have are data from the fall. We'll be collecting data in the spring as well. So some of you might have been a part of that. And then next year, we're going to assess technology and sustainability. We've put sustainability off to the end because we're a little struggling with that a little bit, is in terms of where is that really included in some of our curriculums. But we have a work group that's kind of addressing that. So we have all these ILOs, and on the assessment committee, we have a point person, essentially, for each of those ILOs, and some working groups for each of those ILOs, who are kind of in charge of looking at the data, pulling in people who are knowledgeable in that area, determining action plans, and making sure those action plans happen. So what we're going to do at the end of the session is gather some ideas for some of those working groups from what you see in your interactions with students. The assessment committee has also developed common rubrics for each of these ILOs. You might have seen them. You'll see them here at the end too. And what we're hoping for next academic year is to actually include non-classroom units in ILO assessment. Because one of the struggles with ILOs is that you have to be able to show where they're basically being implemented and assess them. And it's really tough. Where's the best place to assess? It's easiest to assess in classrooms, right? So it's really tough to do non-classroom assessment of some of these ILOs and make sure that every single student is meeting these ILOs or being exposed to these ILOs, and every single student is being assessed. But to me, college is a whole lot more, like the college experience is a whole lot more than just what you learn in a classroom, right? There's a lot of education that happens outside the classroom, and we're trying to somehow channel that. We'll see what happens. So a couple of years ago, we were talking to Deb Meckel about that same issue about non-classroom assessment of ILOs, and she said, if you figure something out, let us know, because you'll be the first that figures it out. So we're hoping to be the first. But anyway, so what we've done so far, we have an oral communication work group, and the writing across the curriculum group has tackled written communication. But both of those things, we had results from last fall, and you might have seen them at one of the assessment days. And based on those results, this oral communication work group kind of came up with a response and an action plan. So again, the response was we needed to improve the reliability and consistency of the data, which we've tried to address by getting a larger sample and more relevant courses. This group wanted to measure students' progress over time. They wanted to see, well, what happened when they first came to college versus what happened when they left here. And they thought faculty, it was kind of a haphazard implementation, and faculty didn't quite know how to use the rubric or how to use it efficiently, so that we had kind of iterator reliability and all those things. So all of those things needed to be addressed. So they came up with an action plan and what they're going to do about it. And I just want to, you can read this all over, but one of the things that did actually happen this semester in oral communication is that thanks to Dana Santos and other people who taught freshman seminar, every student in freshman seminar did a 3-minute oral presentation, and they analyzed all those presentations using our common rubric, and we've got some data on that. So in your packet, sorry, I did not expect this many people to come to such a boring topic, but so I only have 30 handouts, but this presentation, I'm good at selling myself. This presentation is also in Benko Hall in the assessment resources page if you want to look closer at the data. But so they actually, in freshman seminar, they had a sample size of 240 students, and they came up with these data, which you can look at. 2/3 exceeding meeting. Yep.
What was your baseline or your benchmark?
Usually our benchmark is right around 70%. So
that's there.
Not there, but in organization, guidelines, supporting content, a little weak in those areas, right? So this is incoming freshmen, and what this working group wants to do is they want to get another sample of students at the end, you know, in their 4th semester, or maybe in some cases their 8th semester here, and kind of compare results. Was there improvement or not? So
I'm sorry, did you say there were pre and post tests being used or no?
No, not right now. Not yet.
Is that the plan?
That's the plan. That's what they'd like to do.
Monica, is there a midway point?
This work group hasn't decided to do that yet, but maybe that's a great suggestion. Maybe that's what we get to. And again, it's one of those things that, I mean, it's kind of like trying to turn the Titanic. You know what I mean? It's a huge, huge process. And so we're kind of taking a little bit of baby steps, just not to overwhelm everyone. Mm-hmm. So, you know, maybe once we get this process rolling, then we add something like a midpoint assessment or something like that. But don't want to, you know, drown everybody. But so that's kind of an update on oral communication. Written communication, we've got the Ben and is kind of, oh, is he still here? There you are. I was looking on the floor for you. And the writing across the curriculum group has kind of tackled this. And there's, again, reliability and consistency of the data itself. So because I think what was happening was that different people were using different types of assignments. And so what the Writing Across the Curriculum group is doing is actually collecting sample assignments so that we kind of have some kind of idea of what's being used so that we can be a little bit more consistent the next time around, which will be 21-22. Some other kind of responses. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, quick question. So is it required that we have to include students who don't do the assignment?
Oh, that's like
What
the
was that?
hugest,
What was the
yeah.
question?
That's one of the largest top things that are happening. Because, so whenever you give an assignment, a lot of times there's several students who just don't do the assignment. So what do you do without those data points? So some argue that, okay, don't even include them in the assessment, and some argue put them in with do not meet. And I think what we have to do as a campus is come up with some kind of consistent way to address that.
I mean, it could also just be a separate data point.
Yes, or it could be a separate data. Exactly. Yep. Because to me, that's important data. And I think it speaks to what Deb Meckel was talking about before. Why aren't students doing the assignment? Do they just not know how? Are they lazy? Are they like too overwhelmed? Are there issues in their lives that they can't, map things out and take on something big? It's an important data, but we've got to just figure out where to put it. And so I think that's a great discussion that we should have. And maybe it's just as simple as putting another box in compliance assessment. You know what I mean?
Well, rather than it drag down.
But again, and I think that's another thing that, right, they didn't meet it, right? Because they didn't do it, they didn't meet it. But I think that's an important thing too, is don't worry too much about your data. If you have bad data isn't a bad thing. You know what I mean? Come to the math land. We've got bad data all the time. So, like, it's not a bad thing because there are always things to improve. And if you're getting 90 to 100% of the people meeting the standard every time,
You're not challenging them.
are you not challenging them? That's the question. You know what I mean? We complain and complain and complain about, oh, our students are unprepared, oh, they're just doing their work, blah, blah, blah. But then if we get 90 to 100% meeting the standard, that seems odd to me. So don't be afraid of the data that you get. It's all meaningful and it all means something and it can all be used. Okay. You're not going to get fired because you get bad data. Go ahead.
Just real quick, that referring back to that is the issue of non-completion, non-participation. It should be a separate data point with its own benchmark. So.
Right, because you're always going to have one or two students who don't do it, right? Because they, you always get one or two students who just, are here to drink this or smoke the semester away, right? But, there is a benchmark. You're right.
But isn't the importance of accounting for that and accounting for it in a consistent way is because you want to compare year to year to year?
Yeah, exactly.
So if you include them one year and then you
Exactly.
benchmark them another year,
or if
that's
even
not going to make any sense.
exactly, or I think what is happening right now is some people are including it and some people aren't. So to me, I think the best part would make it a separate bond. I don't know.
But you need to make that clear.
Yeah,
for those that are
exactly,
doing that.
exactly. And I think that's something that we just need to decide and just do it, but it's beyond the scope
The
of
numbers
just this
themselves aren't important, but
Right.
the consistency.
Exactly, exactly. Yep.
Oh, one more thing.
Yep.
What's a WAC?
Oh, the Writing Across the Curriculum group.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Some other things that the Writing Across the Curriculum group is doing is they're looking at like an actual, how do we place students in writing courses or English 100, those kinds of things. So that's another thing that they've been working on to try and address some of the results that we had. So you see, like, these ILOs, even though it's kind of tedious to gather even more data and all those things, I think big cross-campus changes can happen as a result of them, or at least that's the intent. So I think most of us kind of get so used to, working in our little box and getting stuff done with our courses that we sometimes don't look at the big picture. And this is a way to look at the big picture and make improvements that might help all of us. So, okay, or at least that's myself. All right, so let's do a quick think, pair, share. So think about it for a second on your own. What are your initial thoughts with regards to these data? How do these results compare to what you witness in your interaction with students every day? So kind of look at some of those oral communication results and you say, oh, that seems reasonable, or that seems weird. Yep. Oh. So think on your own a little bit. Then pair up with somebody sitting next to you and chat about it, and then we'll kind of share what you've talked about. I'll give you a couple minutes.
Even the ones that need just so low.
Yeah. So yeah, try to figure out what somebody
Yeah, don't know what
I mean, the closest.
Right.
there is a room right there.
Like I think language was but you can still give examples of like content.
So it's kind of
Rather than just saying, oh, yeah, right. So I would say, oh, I got better at studying without saying why I like this or
yeah, like what did you back up?
So does anybody have anything they want to share from does anybody have anything they want to share from their discussion? Go ahead, Chris.
Overall, the percentages look poor. The exceeding and meeting, even the ones that are technically meeting, those averages are poor there. We were saying, we reiterated the point that we need to have a separate box to indicate how many students just didn't participate. And then Miriam had a great, pointed out something terrific. She said that we should be focusing on the students that are approaching, and we determine that we should figure out what the specific issues are and then develop special assignments or special sources or resources to help students kind of get over that hump and meet the standard.
That's a good point. Go ahead.
On the approaching, though, look at the outlier there. I mean, what caused that outlier?
Yeah.
Okay.
They can't follow the guidelines.
No.
Is it? Yeah, and that's something that's almost like those study skills. Oh wait, that was the
How many
last
times
session.
did you go over the guidelines?
Right. Yeah.
And was it
Clear.
available for them to go back to and refer to? You know.
That's a good point. Good point.
Yes.
What's that?
Yeah.
Yes, and over and over.
Is there a connection then between understanding the guidelines and then the supporting content? Like
Yeah.
if they didn't know what they were supposed to provide for the guidelines, does that explain why the supporting content wasn't there?
Sure.
So that, I mean, organization.
The other thought, I think that's a great point, and like, so that's an easy fix, right? That's something you can do in your class is, you know, go over things with them, have them ask questions, have them, you know, do pieces at a time, something like that. That's an easy fix.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You know what's interesting? I just thought this as you said all this. My kids in high school, I can't tell you the number of times I've asked my children to see the guidelines on something they're working on, and there are none from high school or middle school classes. Like, students are coming from strong guidelines that explain what they're being expected to do and all, you know, all the parts to a project or whatever. And so, you know, it almost follows that they're not familiar with how to read them or use them or, you know, be aware of them.
And so, just actually, sometimes I think about the guidelines that I've written, and I'm like, it makes perfect sense to me. Why don't they get it? And like, wait, oh, no, it doesn't really make perfect sense when I actually go back and read it. Or, you know, like, it almost helps to have somebody else read your guidelines as well to give you feedback on those things.
My other question was, for this whole thing was, were students allowed to choose a topic? Were they given a topic? Was it something, you know?
Dana, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah. So what happened is this was presented to me, and I didn't like the assignment. I didn't think it would work, so I redid it, and then I sent it to Monica so she could approve it. But basically, it was like they had to, the style, they could be creative with how it was presented, but they needed to cover certain things. Like, for example, you know, if you had to give advice to a first semester freshman, what would it be, you know, after all this? Reflect, what should you, you know, if you could do it again, what would you do differently? So there was like, you know, number 1, you have to do it, number 2, and like number 3, number 4. And so they had to cover that, but the way they covered it was up to them, but there did have to be some oral component. Like, I had a student do this really, really cool like anime cartoon. And so she showed it to the classroom, and I told her, this is awesome, amazing, but you do have to talk and explain something. And she did. And I had other students kind of do your old fashioned, they had a PowerPoint, and that was okay. And I had some students do the video almost looked like, you know, like a reality show when you're like interviewing someone, which was really cute. And then they would have like, one of my students had like really funny text at the bottom, like making jokes. And so that was like, that part is flexible, but they had to.
Well, I found that the creative part that you're talking about, students can get. It's figuring out what they want to talk about. That's always a problem. Like, my students develop web pages, and I'm like, choose something. I don't care. It's your topic. It's your pages. Do whatever you want. Like, what do you mean you're not telling me what to do?
Yeah.
I did. I just told you what to do. Right? But so what I do is I suggest my students come in and have a 5-minute conversation with me, and, you know, 5 minutes, one of my students decided to do their web pages on the different types of skateboards. Who knew that there were 15 different types of skateboards? He did. Right? But he didn't connect that with what he could actually do his project about. So I think that that's sometimes the disconnect, which is why I was asking how the topic got chosen. Because if you give me a topic that I have to talk about, I'm going to hate it.
Right.
I'm not going to support it. I'm going to hit the guidelines minimal where I can. But if you're allowing me to choose a topic that maybe is important to me, that I have a passion about, I'm hoping to be up in that meeting and exceeding.
And actually, one of the things we asked them to do was, what have you learned that you can demonstrate? And so I had a number of students, I think it's called rumping a sheep. I don't know, the vet people can tell me if I'm wrong about that.
That sounds, yeah, sounds curious.
People like were so passionate about this rumping a sheep, and their demo, you know, and talking about it. It was wonderful. It was great. And so, like, you know, that little thing I think was really helpful.
So what was?
Look it up.
Restraining sheet.
Oh, okay.
Calm down.
I thought rumping said rumping a sheep.
I just have a sidebar question. Did you assess the creativity at all?
We did critical thinking.
Okay.
So we did both. We did like oral communication and critical thinking. And for the instructors, it was like in terms of grading. For most, I was like, just like round 1, did they do the things? Just give them 100 if they did the things. But like, we looked at both oral communication and critical thinking for this, and I get it.
I'll show you that data in a minute.
Critical
Yeah.
thinking way the instructors, I think, mostly agree with me, so we'd have to.
Yeah, that's it.
But at least we did look at that. Yeah.
Yep, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Josephine and I actually we thought different to what Chris was saying, that the numbers were actually seemed pretty high. You know, they really met the benchmark, and we were kind of thinking maybe because it's freshman seminar, you know, like the topics are a little more, you know, personal in nature, like easier to talk about maybe. You know, like I wondered if you did this in like a higher level, like argumentation and debate, or, you know, something, if the numbers might be a little different, you know, for some of these other for some of the areas.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good point.
Just real quick, I forgot to mention this. One of the things we reflected on was the fact that all this really tells us is that at some point in this semester, this is where student performance was. We don't have any sense of whether there was improvement or growth.
That's what the group is working on, because
Okay.
they would like to reassess
Right.
later on in the students program. So this is just, again, this is the beginning of the process.
And I'll just say this too. This also isn't related to any kind of broader standard, like some kind of standardized test, or
Yeah.
So it's all kind of, we don't know really where this is at. We don't. You know what I mean?
And I think the idea of trying to keep a standard assignment with a large group of people is trying to address that a little bit. Again, but all assessment doesn't have to be a standardized test, and especially at this level.
Right. That's what I was gonna say. I mean, when we just heard from the SUNY representative, she said that she didn't want it to be so prescriptive that you couldn't have creative freedoms within teaching and for student learning outcomes, and that's the whole point, right? Is that we're supposed to be getting them to grow, but in their own
Embedding
way.
it in what we do.
But I'm just thinking there are probably standards in organizations. You know what I mean?
Well, which we have a rubric for, and the standards are outlined, defined in that rubric. Yep.
I think at some point we'll have to think about too the data that we're collecting at this point, because if at the end we're comparing this to
A different
2-year
group.
students and then we're comparing this
Yeah.
to 4-year students, this data is hard to compare to those.
True.
Because
Good
this
point.
data includes all those people that may not have come back after their first semester because this wasn't for them. Students in the 2-year program may perform differently than students in the 4-year program, so we'll have to think about that.
Yep,
when we're looking at data.
Exactly. Go ahead, Josie.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to say also, on with what Alice said is, I tend to be a purist when it comes to these learning outcomes. That oral communication is oral communication, and if you, pardon me, muddy the waters with asking them to be particularly creative, it kind of diffuses or dilutes the oral aspect of it. From my experience in being in that discipline, and then the same thing with written communication. Again, it's the nature of the assignment that's going to actually determine their mastery of the skill.
And I think that's a difficult part with assessing, because we really want to see, again, these are institutional learning outcomes. So when students leave this institution, do they have these skills? But we have very, very, very different students. A welding student is very, very different than a nursing student. You know what I mean? So we want to see do they have oral communication in their field or written communication in their field, which might be very, very different things, which makes it very difficult to assess, which makes it very difficult to standardize. So again, we're getting a broad picture with these data, but once we have a broad picture, we can disaggregate a little bit and look at different areas to see how they're performing as well and how we can meet those individual needs. So, okay, I want to move on to the next thing. That was a great discussion on a lot of different things, and that's just the beginning. So we have basically some data on 3 other ILOs. And again, critical thinking was assessed last spring. And then we have quantitative reasoning and civic engagement, which were assessed this fall. And again, this is preliminary data. I just want to explain some of these results to you briefly. And then what I would like to do is have all of you split into 3 groups, either critical thinking or quantitative reasoning or civic engagement. So kind of think about which way you want to go. And I've got the rubrics for those ILOs, and I want you to kind of, as a group, talk about what is your response to the data and what are your ideas for action plans for these data or for these ILOs. Because we have these working groups who are working on these things, and the more feedback that we can get from people across campus, the better it is. So you've got work to do. But anyway, so let me tell you, I'm just going to give you brief explanations, and feel free to ask me questions about any of these, and I'll try and answer as best I can. So critical thinking was assessed last spring in these courses that are listed here. ALHC 300, Bio 130, you can read them But the problem was there were different assignments that were used. So some used clinical paperwork, an interview process simulation, math problems, all sorts of different assignments, but all tried to assess critical thinking with this common rubric, critical thinking in their area. And these were the results. Again, I tried to draw a picture, but if I were teaching statistics, I would say this is like the worst misleading graph ever. Because, yeah, but 75% is twice as tall as 66%. So these are some results. But what happened in the fall, as Dana spoke to before, is that they assessed critical thinking, again, with that same assignment. I'm correct, right, Dana? That same presentation assignment that you were talking about. And these were the results from that. So,
What was the first one from?
The first one was from spring 19. The first one was from spring 19, where it assessed results from a whole bunch of different programs, kind of different assignments, but all assessed critical thinking in relevant to their field. And this is just freshman seminar students.
But the first one also included students who were in four-year programs.
Exactly. It included some students in four-year programs, some students in first-year programs, 100-level courses right up to 300-level courses.
So it's what you would expect.
Then what I did here was I put them side by side with the same scale on both things. So it's just interesting. Again, I don't really want to discuss the data at this point, but what I want you to do in your working groups is to try and discuss and analyze and think about action plans. But does anybody have questions about the data itself?
I mean, could you consider the 100 results as a baseline?
And that was the intent of the working group, is to try and come up with some kind of baseline and where to go.
Really not that much improvement. I mean, that's one of the conclusions. But there is improvement.
There is improvement.
It's not the same.
I mean, evidence improved.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Look at the conclusion. No, if you look at the numbers, I mean, 59 to 65, 66, I think. That's a little something, not much.
No,
But that may not even be statistically significant.
Right,
It could just
exactly.
be random variation.
Exactly.
So if it was like 15 or 20 there, I think we'd feel more confident.
So again, think about the data. You're going to get to talk about it more. I just want to give you some background information about the data itself.
Oh, and what's the number of students?
For which? For
relative.
good question. I can't remember what the number of students were for this. I could look that up. It was
As many as in the
5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It was in the hundreds. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And this is 240. Okay, I could look up that information for you though. Okay, so there's civic engagement. Critical thinking. So think about that if you'd like to work in that little group in a minute. Quantitative reasoning. So these were results that were collected in the fall through a variety of courses across math. You notice the N here, I wrote 465 to 537. In a couple courses, I think it was the accounting courses, they didn't feel like that they could actually assess certain parts of this rubric, that like the inherent nature of the course didn't really address all of those things, so they left that just blank. So some have 500, some of those categories have 537 students, some only have 465. So, yeah.
So this was not a specific assignment, this was an overall course analysis for final
No,
grade?
this was these were some kind of assignment, some kind of assignment in the course. It might have been a test, a final exam, something like a project, something like that. Okay, but again, they were different assignments for each course, but same rubric. Okay. Basic information about quantitative reasoning, and then civic engagement. So again, these were assessed in multiple courses. We had an N of 130, it's a little bit difficult to know what some of these categories mean, but if you choose to work in this work group, I have the rubrics itself, which kind of defines a little bit better what those categories mean. So what do we have left? 20 minutes?
17.
Oh, okay, crap. All right, so here we go. So if you would like to work on, what do I have first? Civic engagement, come to the front. Come to the front, okay? What I have are copies of the rubrics, and I need one person in the civic in each group to be kind of a note taker. And I basically kind of respond to the data and jot down some ideas for action plans, okay? So civic engagement is right here. Who's next? Quantitative reasoning. You want to be quantitative reasoning? There you go. And in the back here, critical thinking.
Well, we'll design.
Thank you.
Oh, we changed the all right, I felt very
I didn't get it.
I don't know if anybody heard that, but
It's a
Yeah, I did too. I went to the laser and I'm like,
all right, I'll pass them along.
Anybody use this for every class?
This semester?
Is the sign-in sheet anywhere?
I did.
I did.
And not for us. Yeah, I got for our nutrition class. But it was actually a number of different assignments. First, that's why it was you had for us first time in fail, you actually used this one per day. That was, and probably my own fault too. We had, oh yeah, the senior level, we have to assess this. We did it all, but now we have to assess it. So, I don't know.
So you're saying it's either a 4 or there's a 1.
Yeah, right. Because when you look at it, work, so and a lot of it is observation based. So it's very subjective when it comes to saying like, did the students,
What are you teaching?
Clinical calculations.
When you're looking at things like analysis of knowledge,
Yeah, and it would be hard to explain their course. And so therefore they accept their score.
right.
It's just so difficult. When I teach creative writing, I
And a
always
chance
have
for
that trouble,
remediation.
because they don't know.
Seems like that's not really a course that
How I know.
can be analyzed.
Right, like, for example, by saying.
So that was that's what was learned.
Okay, yeah,
Like,
so
I
it
didn't
didn't
even
really
realize
like
that.
that.
Like I'll tell you when you're.
That's on the back page, it's under civic, problem solving and leadership.
Thank you. Well, what if,
I mean,
what's
again,
your exit level
this is
mastery
something
degree?
where, like, this one, communicate with others in context.
They
Well,
don't
they
take
take
any
statistics.
statistics. So statistics being applicable one for school and nursing?
Well, and that's the thing, is that a lot of, so, this is connected to
They
a
did.
lot
Yeah.
of,
We've been separate.
you need this like service learning
Why do you need a
courses,
separate
which I know is also something that is changing, we're shifting it, they're getting more of
They're getting your students on.
And there's
okay.
yeah. So that's, I think, one of the hard things. And the other part is that this was, again, not one of those blanket assignments. This was assessed differently in every course. That's just my experience with how we
So
assess
we
it.
should look at the
top
statistics
20.
class.
So, and I'm saying,
Well, it sounds like
it was the number of assignments really that went
Zero
through
for
the entire
Well, the zero, right, it says-
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, it's not a pass-through course, it's just that one. Yeah, so one of the,
Do you have a homework assignment that is?
forget exactly how I
Is
worded
there
it, but
anything else
basically what we
that's
did was,
evidence?
we looked at,
Like a practice test that
we
you
looked at
bring?
trends in
No.
our nation, and we looked at, for example, gender-based sustainability, and we looked at how our nation compares to the rest of the world. We had students examine how they can individually make impacts with their
Yeah,
choices.
I agree.
And then
We
we
might have to
talked about
create
a
a
number
new
of different
assignment that demonstrates
projects that
stuff, so you
in the
can
restaurant
evaluate
industry
it
could
specifically
sort of
for
latch
this
onto
instead
as a way
of
to
pass-fail.
combat this. And so one of
The
the
other
things
thing,
that
just
we
to add
chose as
to it
a,
though, is this is a
was
class, this is actually an
sustainable
assignment that is
products.
within
And so we
four,
talked
within
about
four
how
classes.
by
So they
using
take a test
during
semester
dining
in
options,
nursing,
individually
they get
choosing
one
them,
and
and
four,
also offering
second
those
semester, one
menus.
and four,
You
third,
can
and
provide
so it kind of is
for
like,
people to,
an odd
basically it was about
thread, it's a thread.
choosing non-meat options
It's an
or
assignment.
blended meat options.
So
So
I like what you're
experimented
saying.
with several
You go
different
to statistics.
I don't know.
protein
What creates the
burgers,
institution?
and we did a taste testing, and we did an analysis of those.
So how did they get the grade if they chose a different?
After marketing is the same as that.
Is that a big, there's no difference in themselves?
After yours, it's the same as their stuff.
Well, a lot of it was an assignment, the assignments were like, well, it was about, you know, if you choose a non-meat option, what are some of the benefits to that? So it was about students talking about those benefits, and it
Oh,
was.
what other assignments they have?
Each student had to, come up with a research or find, you know, alternative protein in 4 different areas, and we talked about things like, we did one that was a blended, so it was half meat, half mushroom. We did one where it was complete protein, so it was a legume plus a.
It depends on how bad the path is.
Sorry.
I just heard them.
Yeah. We did one that was
You guys think
all
those district numbers are really high?
and,
I mean,
we did one that was,
it's gotta be artificially high
you know,
because
that
it's
had
like,
nuts in it as
these are
a.
super high numbers.
So they had assignment where they had
Well,
to,
you're only gonna probably talk about.
recipes in all these different categories.
Yeah, this
And
is
so
artificially high.
use
Or
that as
look
a
at any
way
other
to,
tea.
and then they had
I mean, these
to,
are high compared to other.
they had to communicate that to the group that we just so when I did this in my class, we did a class form talking about why it's important to choose.
I was like wrestling
criteria and
evaluation points.
They had to address the sustainability
Really
aspect.
hard.
I have a sustainability.
I had a thing going on. I knew what I was doing, but I'm not sure it all communicates the same.
But in their presentations, it was really informative for us because our students were able to say, you know, this is better when you're looking at carbon dioxide. This is better when you're looking at locally sourced versus traveling over miles. This is better health-wise for people individually. This is better for communities. This is better for, you know, whatever. But then they also said, if you're using this nut-based burger, then you're not being inclusive to the community because obviously that's not. So they had to basically weigh all of the kind of civic pros and cons of what they were doing, and then we can kind of verify why they chose what they chose as the best.
Right.
What she was saying
is also very specific to
Right,
yours
yeah.
in the different segment nursing, and I think that might be something we have to apply to this, because all the math principles are the same. Where we're asking like very, very specific
And that was, was there any, beside the rubric, was there any other commonality?
I mean, ideally, if we're doing evidence-based practice and everything, we should be able to grasp.
So, yes,
We need to know.
my opinion,
And that is not a graph.
then the communication aspect.
So I don't know maybe if the rubric needs
But it's good for anything. We can talk the same
Well,
class.
as simple as
Yeah,
I
yeah,
want
yeah.
to
It's not a graph.
save
An assignment from our classes. We're gonna have our own. This isn't here anyway, no matter what.
What I'm saying is that
Maybe the rubric has to apply a little bit more to the.
Right.
My
point is the operation is saying, your data points, your come on, and you're physically to the
Right, what do you call it?
What do you, exactly, that's one of
That people.
Actually,
So when
right,
you're-
completely,
Yeah.
on their.
When your students fail, are they totally,
We're not collecting feedback
Yeah.
from the those students that are
I think if we look at
I
the
guess our
data,
problem is it's either a one or a four, and so it's gonna
specific
skew
identity-
these results.
Right.
But when you
Yeah,
looked
you
at
know,
that
as the
as the
lowest,
like they failed among
the
those,
test,
so they
I think is
failed
also
the outcome.
hardest
You have to
to
look at what they're actually doing within that, right? And you have to just say,
Yeah.
because it's like the
Because
assignment
that's how-
isn't,
how
the
does the
assignment
student
isn't what you're,
relate
you know what I mean? It's not the overall.
No,
grade.
we had to go and see if like.
And I want to commit.
Right.
I don't know what I'm doing tomorrow. How do I know what I have to get is to,
we don't have
to nut base the routine.
I know, right. No, right.
There's something to water out of California, we're not gonna have almonds, and I don't know what's happening.
There are so many factors involved.
No, no, no. I was not a class that did this, but I have a class that
the time where
I
the
know that they allow
flexibility
it
to give them additional
feedback
assignments.
is valid.
For
I
instance,
made
our
them
semester,
volunteer at an event.
probably
So they
second.
said, this isn't volunteerism. So what they were kind of saying
Because
is,
we do
I'm not
it
choosing to
for
be civically
drama.
engaged. You're forcing me to be
Yeah.
civically engaged. So,
I don't know.
so would they be doing it? if
So am I
wasn't saying
hearing that we
I'm
should
saying
take those that are
Then yeah,
successful
valid then.
Yeah.
and then put them on the rubric, because it's been that formatted, but those that have achieved the 9 or greater,
I
they're
was
going to follow the rubric.
So much further for them to go just to get that.
Right, and we also talked about that too, because we talk about how across the
And this is
globe,
really
different cultures
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
such standards
Yeah.
already
Monica
innately
say
in
that you
their
found
diets
one?
that it's
There was
we
like
did
a
in culture. And so we talked about having to have some sort of.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
of all course that too, so they talk about that as like feedback versus across the globe.
Yeah, is that the same issue or? No, because she eliminated
So what would
data
you
points.
do?
Yeah, it works, because I did ask,
Yeah.
you know, maybe you guys should say to your dean, like, maybe this course is, or whoever's working on this, I don't know, like,
Write that down on your action plan.
this course is the best one place.
Not, it is not a place you have.
Reality is
Quantitative.
And all of that,
Unless you should have it,
general.
but as terms of the what which course math should be used for
Yeah,
fun.
you did.
You did, yeah, some areas did.
Which is the best
They
promotion.
can help your cultural.
But this
culture.
is-
Yeah.
And all of
I think they don't feel
that-
comfortable in college.
You don't share that.
They don't feel comfortable in college.
Well, it's a class every semester.
It's like you're still-
It's basically the same assignment, you order to figure out how much the same as
I mean, I
So I'm sorry to stop you, but we've got 4 or 5 minutes left. I just want to make a couple announcements and then have you share out a little bit about what you kind of came out with. First of all, if any of you are interested in being on one of these work groups for any of these areas, we would love, love, love to have you. Just let me know and I'll write you down and somebody will be in contact. I think the more representation we can have across campus so that we know a lot of those issues that are happening in different departments in different areas, the better it'll be and the more meaningful our data will be. I think that was my only thought. I can't remember. But anyway, what does, if you have just like a quick 1 minute share of what you talked about or what you kind of came up with, that would be great. Anybody want to go?
I can read what I wrote.
Sure.
Okay. So when we talked about our response to the data and like what we were measuring, we talked about how do you analyze data from students if the assignment is reflective or opinion based. So if they had to be civically involved and then write a reaction, that's different than some other ways that it might be measured. We talked again about the variability in assignments. The only consistent thing was the rubric, so it could be difficult to compare data. And then we talked about, what really qualifies as volunteerism and civic engagement when they're being forced to do it for their classes. So is it true civic engagement?
Yeah, that's true.
And then
will be civically engaged.
Right.
With democracy.
Right.
So that may factor into this at some point. And then we talked about how do we measure the long-term impact. So if you look at the rubric, it mentions some kind of long-term things that we at this point don't have the ability to measure. And then as far as the action plan, Lisa had a really great point that we should also be collecting feedback from the community or the civic organizations that we're working with on these projects to get the full picture of the impact of what we're doing.
Along those lines too, I just popped in my head when you were thinking of saying the long-term effects of civic engagement. It might be something that it gets put on a 5-year graduate survey or something like that about, did my experience at SUNY Delhi affect how what I do? What do you laugh at?
We don't have one of those.
We do. Like 5 people answer it, but that's it. All right, so great. How about you?
After this, we rescind your grade.
So what we focus on is on the nursing program, because the nursing program, the way they use their math, especially for clinical calculation, we feel that maybe it needs to be re-evaluated because the results made of skewed the results. So we were looking at that and maybe thinking maybe more using the statistics aspect of the nursing program as a criteria for the.
And I think that's sorry, just a second. I think that's important to know. I think with all assessment, remember like back when we started all this stuff and we assessed some things and we're like, that was crap. You know what I mean? So I think with this whole ILO assessment, it's a learning process in and of itself, and we get a little bit better in each iteration on how we get good data. So I think that's good to know.
I think you should abandon the homogeneity of your data.
Yeah.
And accept the fact that each of the schools will have their own system. As long as they have the end count you want to be meaningful, ignore the fact that they're not the same.
Yep.
Because I don't want to play ball with them.
Right. I never would have guessed that.
No, but they're not the same thing.
No, and again, and I think looking at the disaggregating this data.
Run welding know how welders should speak. Know what quantitative analysis they have to do as a welder. And have the same respect for the nursing program.
So rather than lumping all this data together, show it.
Just say these are the requirements and structure, and trust the fact you'll be all right.
No, I think that's a great idea.
Wouldn't be a bad thing.
So.
Because I can make the data is totally.
It's all of it, right?
Of the data.
Right.
You're 75% in quantitative reasoning. I have not evidenced. I have evidenced the opposite.
Yeah. And that was one of my things with the quantitative reasoning, that basic math skills, that it was 84%.
Give me a break.
I'm not seeing that at all. Yeah, I'm not seeing that at all. Yeah. So, okay. So write all those things down. Write all those things down as an action plan for suggestions. Those are great suggestions. How about you guys are talking?
No problem.
Or we have different professors ways. So I guess that kind of speaks a little bit to Doug's point as well. But for action plan, figuring out what classes for post-assessment and then kind of underway. Thinking about norming or how we could create consistent assessment across different professors and classes. And also we brought up the point that the student should know what we're assessing them on and maybe see these rubrics and know what outcomes we're looking
And I think I mentioned this to somebody else. I started using for my writing assignments, I just use that written communication. Yeah. Because first of all, it's a great rubric. And, you know, yeah, Ben. Yeah. So, you know, if you're kind of showing that, if people see that same rubric maybe in multiple courses across, they might say, whoa, maybe there's something going on. Anyway, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
Did you grab the assignment sheet if you didn't?
And if you would like, yeah, let me have your note sheets. If you would like to be on one of these working groups, let me know.
Guys.
Sorry, it's not all your fault.
Well, I will say that I do do a little quantitative analysis because
Good, how are you? Happy New Year.
But they have.
David, I'm going over to eat.
Okay.
To get them to
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, do you like an email?
multi stuff.
I hear you. Yeah.
So,
All right, let me, I'm gonna
Excuse
I'm
me?
gonna just write myself, no, full nurses out of,
There's like that.
yes, and I'll send it to you.